Hi, my name is Jerome Copulsky, and I am a research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and Global Affairs at Georgetown University. Today, I'm here to have a conversation with Laura K. Field. And Laura is an associate with the Liberalism Studies program at George Washington University, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and visiting scholar in residence at American University. In addition to her academic work, Laura has written about the New Right for the New Republic, Politico, The Bulwark, Le Monde, and other publications, and she holds a PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin. She lives in Washington, D.C., and today we are here to discuss her fabulous and important new book, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right, and it's out with Princeton University Press. So Laura, great to see you. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss your work today. And I want to begin. Furious Minds is a wonderful book. It's a timely book. It's in many ways a terrifying book, and in some ways a funny book. I want to begin by asking how this book came to be. So if you can maybe share a little bit of your intellectual background and how your own experiences brought you to the subject of the MAGA New Right
Thank
and
you,
shaped your
Jerome.
approach. Yes.
Thanks, Jerome. And let me say, I'm so happy to be here with you and for this organization. Jerome is also an author of a book called American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. And it's a book that I've learned a lot from. And he talks about some of the same characters who I discuss in my book. So, and has been a big champion for my work. So thank you, Jerome. So this book, my background is in political philosophy, and I studied sort of traditional political philosophy with some conservative scholars. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta originally, and sort of I joke in the book that I got red pilled by Plato. But basically, I studied with these Straussian scholars, and then went in Alberta, just fell in love with Plato and all these ideas, and then went and did my PhD in Texas with some other Straussians and wrote on Rousseau and Nietzsche. And then around 2016, I was already kind of moving away from some of that stuff, just intellectually. But after the 2016 election, it came to my attention that several of the people who were on the forefront of defending Trump intellectually were from adjacent circles to the ones I had been in academia, sort of these other parts of conservative academia. And I was kind of naive at the time, and I was scandalized by that. And so I started paying some close attention to what was going on in defense of what I call the MAGA New Right. And so I started writing about it and have been doing that since about 2019. And so the kind of culmination of that is this book.
So how do you come to see and understand the formation of this MAGA New Right, especially when you're coming out, as a scholar of political theory? You've studied with Straussians, you were influenced by the Straussian approach. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what that means and how the people who came from that approach really were some of the leading intellectuals supporting Trump in 2016 and 17 and going forward.
So the story I'm telling in the book is one of sort of ideological radicalization, right? And so and ideological capture and institutional chapter. So it sort of spans 2016 to 2024. In the beginnings of that, a lot of it was sort of backfilling ideology for Trump, right? These people that I'm writing about probably wouldn't have chosen Trump from a list of candidates, but they saw his potential, right, as a kind of destroyer and just somebody who could totally change things and totally overhaul American politics, and in ways that they specifically were attracted to. And so the first people to do that were some people at the Claremont Institute or affiliated with the Claremont Institute. The very first essay defending Trump publicly by an academic or sort of academic was Michael Anton's Flight 93 election, which people have probably heard of by now. And so he was the first to kind of push the envelope and say, look, there is a reason. I don't think the essay is very outrageous in its rhetoric, and I'm not saying it's reasonable, but he did give sort of intellectual articulation to the kind of formula that was fueling Trump. And so we could talk a little bit about how how that differs from maybe the conservatism that came before. I think that there's some useful, just sort of clear things we can talk about there. But basically, he saw some potential in Trump. He saw how it connected to old traditions in American conservatism, especially, and then ran with it. And so that started this sort of generative movement on the right, where over the course of the first Trump administration, a whole bunch of different people from different cohorts of the conservative intellectual movement got together and really started making these arguments and organizing together. And then I would say, and I think that the narrative of the book sort of reaffirms this. The movement didn't really come into its own until the Biden administration and until 2022, 2023, when they really, really got their bearings. They kind of got through the January 6th crisis and then coalesced into something much more powerful. So we could talk about some of those successes and how it all happened. But
yeah, so your book, so Furious Minds is really one of the themes that runs through this book is the intellectual transformation of American conservatism during the Trump, right? From the time, Trump comes down the golden escalator through his first term, through January 6th and the aftermath, and the Biden administration. So what, you mentioned Michael Anton in this seminal essay. What is the MAGA New Right, and how does this new movement differ from earlier conservative intellectual and political movements in the country?
So the MAGA New Right that's sort of my formulation that came together because they were all calling it the New Right, but I wanted to differentiate it from other New Rights because every sort of new iteration of conservative intellectual life is called the New Right. So anyway, this is the MAGA New Right, and it is, my book focuses quite narrowly in a way on the intellectual people who were fueling Trumpism and defending Trumpism intellectually. And so substantively, I think it's useful to think of this old trope about Reaganism. Reagan talks about the Gipper's stool and as a way of representing the old fusionism. And so this was the sort of through the Reagan-Buckley era of conservatism, what we think of now as the old establishment. You have an ideological combination of social conservatism, economic liberalism, or fiscal conservatism, I guess, sort of small government, free trade, liberal economics, and anti-communism, which also kind of bleeds into a kind of liberal internationalism that we see with Reagan. And so those three things together are understood as sort of the core of the conservative movement. I think most listeners probably are familiar with that, and that feels familiar to them. The MAGA New Right preserves that social conservatism part of the fusion and even just doubles down on it, right? But then Anton has a useful formula from that 2016 essay where he says Trumpism is nationalist economics, secure borders, and America first foreign policy. So that's his new formula. And so you can see there's a real shift there from Reaganism, right? No longer are we talking about free trade. It's about, tariffs and nationalist economic policy. And then the anti-communism is still there and fueling some of this. But after the end of the Cold War, that became less important.
Like anti-wokeism now, right?
So now it's anti-woke neo-Marxism, right? It's not exactly, it's still anti-Marxist, but it's not, it doesn't have the same energy it did. And so it's kind of a nationalist foreign policy, very much centered around the nation state. And has none of that sort of let's build a liberal international order that the older establishment neoconservatism certainly held on to. So that's the substance.
Yeah, and it gets kind of reaffirmed in that famous or infamous First Things Manifesto against the Dead Consensus, right? Which is really an articulation of against that old fusionist, Reaganite, Buckleyite kind of conservatism, and in favor of something new, which Trump is ushering in.
Yeah, that's right. So there are several key moments, and that's one of them where sort of these characters who most people probably haven't heard of, maybe they have, maybe the New Yorkers have, right? They get together, and so the Flight 93 essay publication is one, and then Rush Limbaugh reads that out loud, so it becomes quite well known on the right. And then they have, I think it was maybe 2018. I don't know when, I can't remember. Against the Dead Consensus was this sort of collective letter in the First Things journal, which is a sort of premier religious conservative outlet. And again, making some of these same arguments, but again, with a sort of social traditionalism infusing it. And so a collection of people signed on to that. And then you have also in the Biden era, the beginnings of this national conservative movement, which is organized by an Israeli American named Yoram Hazony, who wrote a book in 2018 called The Virtue of Nationalism. And he started organizing on behalf of the new right quite early on, having conferences, not just in DC, but in Europe as well. And just providing a forum for people to get together and bringing people on board from formerly mainstream conservatism as well.
And you've gone to some of these conferences. I think one of the virtues of this book is that you actually go in and listen to these lectures and meet some of these people who are giving these talks, who are part of the mind of the new right. So you're giving us a kind of on the ground tour of this new phenomenon. We mentioned the First Things essay, and one of the people who I think was involved in putting that together was a journalist named Sora Bomari. You've mentioned how your book focuses on intellectuals rather than conventional political actors. So I'm wondering if you can share how you chose the cast of characters that show up throughout this work.
Yes, sure. I mean, I'm happy to do that. I also want to say it's not a work of reporting, right? So I don't want to overstate how much I got in there. And partly they wouldn't let me go to the National Conservatism Conference. I didn't try very hard, but I did try to go to the one in 2024. And they wouldn't let me in, even though a lot of other people got in. So, and maybe, that I don't know exactly what was going on there, but I have gone to a few of these things. I've certainly been around these people and gone to many events where they're speakers, and have certainly met a few and knew a few in my sort of former life. So, okay. So the cast of characters, yeah, it was tricky. The MAGA world, right, generally speaking, is very big and there's a lot going on. And it's obviously, I think everyone can understand how hard it is to keep track of everything because things are moving so quickly. So I started writing about the kind of PhD version, contingent of the new right in 2019. And that's who I really was focused on. And so when I was writing the book, I thought, well, I've got to narrow this down somehow. I can't include every big influencer or every person who's important to the movement or every religious figure. So what I really ended up focusing on is people who had PhDs. And that wasn't a kind of gatekeeping. It was just a way to kind of help me understand. I mean, I guess it was, but it was a way of helping me understand, focus my energy on the most important people and the most serious ideas that were taking shape here. And then I also sort of allowed several people through who were just obviously pivotal to the organizing or to the ideas that were dominating. So Michael Anton is an example there, or somebody like Christopher Rufo, who I don't think has a doctorate, but that doesn't matter. I mean, he's clearly really important to this side of things. And so it ended up being all men. There are certainly some women mentioned in the book, but it ended up being all men because I was thinking, well, who sort of fits my mold here? Who works? What women should I be including? And there simply weren't any women who had that kind of stature in the intellectual spheres here, or who I could tell were well regarded and cited by the people I write about. So they got excluded, and so that's a weird thing about the book. But I think that was just sort of an organic thing that happened.
Mm-hmm. And I think we'll touch again on this issue because one of the themes that you discuss of this MAGA new right is reaffirmation of notions of patriarchy and a kind of independent misogyny that goes along with it.
Yeah. Well, I'll say a little bit about that now, just because it's easy to think that this is all something totally new, right? And I think it's important to note that there are sort of undercurrents on the American right that have sort of smacked of Trumpism going back decades and decades back to what is called the old right in the early part of the 20th century. So some of these themes like America First, right, or the economic nationalism, some of the other things that get taken up, or at least small government is certainly not a new theme. But that's just to say that there are all these threads of like, and all of these figures also, like Pat Buchanan or the Tea Party movement, Barry Goldwater, I talk about quite a bit in the book. These are all things that have been sort of fomenting on the right and appear again and again over time. And I think anti-feminism has certainly been part of that story on the sort of the extremes of the American right, but this is something different. And so I say that this current iteration, sort of the MAGA new right, is different from those older paleoconservatism or like Goldwaterism, because of its, I say that it's success, obviously, right? This is the first time these guys have been in charge. Also for its misogyny, there's a kind of real anti-woman, hatred of women, a desire to bring women down is sort of pervasive in the movement, as well as just a social media savvy, right? And a kind of culture warrior spirit that I think was there, but less successful in prior versions.
The very online nature.
Very online.
These ideas are circulating, not only in the academy, but then are making it out into places like Twitter and X and other social networks.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to gauge some of this. While you're writing, you're sitting in your own online world writing a book, but I think I've done a few public events, and I think of one in particular right after the election last year, where I was just talking about the election fallout, and after that event, a young man came up to me because I had mentioned Bronze Age pervert, who is sort of the worst of the online, what I call the hard right in the book, who's really he's just seething with disgust with women, right? His book, which is a very funny book, and they're very happy to mock women. So I had mentioned the Bronze Age pervert in the course of my conversation that day. And this
also as a Yale PhD.
Also a Yale PhD with sort of some of these Straussian backgrounds similar to my own in a way. And so I had mentioned this, and this young man came up to me, right? And he wanted to talk to me because I don't think he had heard, people talking about this, but he was paying attention to Bronze Age pervert and Curtis Yarvin and this sort of like world that I had also been paying attention to and, was quite familiar with. So we had a long talk. We had a Zoom call later. And I think a lot of young men, right, are attracted to this. If you've seen, if you saw that discussion with Mehdi Hassan about where he was talking to all these 20 young people, he was sitting in the middle of the circle. I think it was the Jubilee or something, but 20 million or something people watched this. So I think a lot of listeners will have seen it. A lot of those young men sounded a lot like the characters I write about, right? They were spouting some of these same arguments, talking the same way. And so I think it's hard to gauge how pervasive this stuff is, but I think a lot of the staffers are reading the men I'm writing about and are sort of caught up in this wave of this culture warrior.
So it certainly has an audience, right? Certainly,
yeah.
Hitting a nerve. I'm going to swing back to that, but before I go, I want to. We've been talking about these people as intellectuals, and one of the things that they share is that they believe that to quote a phrase, ideas have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, that in a sense, the political power begins with a political vision. Yeah. And I was wondering maybe if you can say a bit about like why, how important these ideas are for the way in which they understand how the world works and how politics works.
Yeah, so I guess that's something that is a sort of sub-theme in the book, and I call it, and it's this tendency of the MAGA new right, the intellectuals, and this whole sort of online world to think that what matters in politics are how we think, our principles, the stories we tell in a way, and our devotion to certain kinds of principles. And it goes back to this phrase that you just quoted, ideas have consequences, which is the title of a book by Richard Weaver. And the book actually was about how modern ideas have really terrible consequences. So it was like this big sort of full throttle attack on modernity. And there's a lot of that in the MAGA new right. So a lot of just, we could call it regressive or reactionary thinking, but I think what they're taking issue with is the kind of chaotic, fragmented way that the modern world works, right? And they're saying we need to get back to a place where we all can have a shared understanding. And I call it in the book ideas first political philosophy, right? And so because all of them are trying to bring back a way of understanding that is much more singular, anti-pluralistic. They want something to hold on to intellectually, and they want to impose that on the country. I mean, I think that a lot of people are searching for meaning, right, and are searching for a way of understanding the world, and so and are obviously, I think a lot of people are struggling with these questions. So the MAGA New Right sort of comes into that vacuum, and we could talk about the causes of that in sort of liberal modernity, but they're seeing that problem and they're saying, we have some answers, we have something to say to this, and then we want to impose our vision on the country to reassert these sort of dominant ideational structures. So I call it ideas first political philosophy. I mean, I think it's kind of like there are big problems with this, but you can kind of see the allure. And it's a way of thinking that, well, I think it's a way of thinking that is really attractive, but is also can be really misguided, right? And so part of what's happening here is they think that this is the way that you can change the world by kind of it's I think of it as the field of dreams style of political philosophy, right? If you build it online, they will come, right? You posit this world and you talk about these big ideas and the world will come with you. And in some ways, they've been very successful with this, right? They've had enormous amount of success, and they have stirred up a lot of intellectual, chaos in a way. But they've really made their mark now. They've got J.D. Vance in the vice president's office with this approach. So it's kind of this culture warrior, ideas forward approach. All right, but I just want to say, I'm going to say two more little quick things. Sorry, I'm going on. I think that I don't hate the ideas first approach. Like I have a lot of that in me myself with my background in political philosophy. But I think the problem is a lot of the ideas they're trying to impose are bad ideas, right? You need ideas in politics, but these ideas are not always very good. A lot of it's nativism, sort of raised to a principle. And the other thing I'd say is a lot of their ideas are just sort of detached from the reality around us and are really they're willing to dehumanize their opponents. It gets really ugly. And it's, I think, disconnected from the pluralism that we find in America and have since the beginning.
Yeah, so I want to maybe swing back later in our conversation to J.D. Vance and wonder if in fact what we're getting is a kind of a theory of Trump or Trumpism or a theory of Vanceism. Or who would really represent or carry these ideas. But to swing back to what you were just saying, you note in your book, and I'm quoting now, growing right-wing extremism has not emerged in a vacuum, but in many instances is a response, however misguided, to real problems and to the real vulnerabilities of liberal democracy. Unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
These MAGA intellectuals, they attack what they perceive as weaknesses or failings, both in liberalism, pluralism, vision of political equality, and what have you, as well as in earlier conservatism, as we've discussed earlier. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you evaluate their arguments, their argument against the liberal democratic order that we're existing in, and why do you think so many Americans, particularly young Americans, are finding these criticisms, and finding the ideas to replace the American order so compelling?
So I just want to say that the new right that I talk about exists as sort of a clustered network of different cohorts, right? And so I've mentioned a few of them already, but each of these different groups, I think it's true that they all want to impose a sort of a singular vision on the country, but some of those visions differ a little bit, right? And so you have some like the Claremont group. They are obsessed with the American founding. They think they have the true understanding of the American founding. And so when we talk about their critique of liberalism today, they tell a story of decline away from this perfect ideal of the founding. You have
Like Michael Anton,
Michael Anton, John Eastman, who was involved in the January 6th uh, attack on the Capitol, Charles Kessler. They talk about sort of a lot of the most extreme people at the Claremont Institute think that the current way that the Constitution worked until Trump's election was the kind of progressive liberal Constitution, and that it was a complete departure and degradation of the original Constitution, the Founders' Constitution. And so they see themselves as counter-revolutionaries trying to restore that older America. Other groups like the NatCons, their beef is that we don't have a unified nation. And so they're trying to restore the unified nation. And there's a little more of a flavor of ethno-nationalism there, though they don't tend to put it in those terms, but there's a kind of a religious fervor there. They want to restore the Christian nation. And then the post-liberal Catholics have a sort of more high-minded critique, or high-minded isn't quite right, but a more intellectual critique of liberalism that resonates with sort of old, well, you know this better than me, the old conservative Catholic arguments against liberal democracy. And Patrick Deneen is the sort of go-to person for this. He wrote a book in 2018 called Why Liberalism Failed. And his critique of liberalism is that the sort of underlying foundations of liberal democracy are sort of rotten from the start because it's based on a kind of individualist anthropology. So he talks about liberal individualism as something that, because we care about human rights, because we care about individual autonomy and individual freedom, that those concerns are bound to destroy the social fabric and cause an incredible instability within the political order, instability in our academic institutions, instability in economic order. He goes through all the different sort of ways of thinking about society, and he says liberalism disintegrates and acts as a solvent on our social life and on our political life. And so
a bad idea that has had these terrible consequences.
Yeah, I mean, he grants that it has had some good consequences, but overall, it's this sort of self-defeating force that the stronger it gets, the more it destroys itself, and it's sort of self-cannibalizing phenomenon. And so he's looking beyond liberal democracy to try to imagine a new way forward. And his next book was called Regime Change. So that's the kind of critique of liberal democracy. And I think I think a lot of these ideas are very worth thinking through and are worth taking seriously, but there's also a kind of problem at the core. I mean, I think about liberalism as something that emerged out of religious conflict, right? In my political theory brain, it started in early modernity in England and Scotland, right? If you read thinkers like Locke and Hobbes, Rousseau, these are some of the people. They weren't all liberals, but they were thinking through ways to get past the religious conflicts and the religious warfare that was tearing apart society at that time. And I think the American founders were very influenced by that. And they were thinking to try to basically turn down the temperature in political life and find ways to live together politically that weren't so explosive. And so when we talk about the roots of some of these problems, I think what the early moderns were doing, we're trying to turn our attention a little bit away to these big questions of meaning and religion that were causing so much conflict and destruction. So that kind of gets us
separation of church and state, right? As a constitutional
separation of church and state, yeah, separation of powers. I mean, in the American system, we have the Federalist principle, and so these were, and commerce. They were all trying to kind of pitch commerce as a new way of sort of taking people's attention away from. I mean, sort of. There were other things going on, right? But thinking, well, this might be a good way to direct people's ambitions away from religious fanaticism, essentially. And when I read the new right thinkers, they're not being very careful about that legacy. And they're not being very careful to avoid turning our attention back to religious fanaticism, and they're not doing very well at preempting that kind of return to fanaticism. I think they're actually fostering a kind of return to not just religious fanaticism, but political fanaticism, nativism, and ethno-nationalism. So they are exploiting this vulnerability of liberal democracy, which is that it sort of pushes us to avoid questions of meaning. It pushes liberals tend to avoid questions of meaning and purpose and the good life, right? And so that's the kind of problem in our culture. I think that a lot of us have been taking our way of life for granted, aren't very good about talking about moral questions and how they relate to or don't relate to political life. And in some cases have become kind of self-righteous because we're unthinking about moral life. So that I think all of these are sub-themes in the book. I mean, I could talk on and on about it, but they're exploiting that vulnerability. I mean, the best example of this vulnerability might be the rise of Jordan Peterson, right? As this kind of guru who young men are looking to for guidance. I mean, if Jordan Peterson is the guy they're looking to, let alone like Andrew Tate and some of the current people or Bronze Age pervert, what does that say about our culture, right? What does that say about our capacity to live in community with each other, articulate, talk about the good life, questions of meaning. So these are some of the themes that I try to explore.
So you're kind of explaining why there's an appeal, especially among younger men. I mean, if you've gone to the NatCon conference or some of these other conferences, one of the things that's interesting is that there's so many young people there, particularly so many young men
Yeah.
who are finding who are looking to someone like Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeule or Yoram Hazony for kind of guidance, intellectual guidance and guidance. You mentioned that there are these different camps within the New Right, sort of the Claremonters, the Restorationists, the Catholic post-liberalisms, the NatCons. They all want to turn their back on pluralistic liberal democracy, but they all have dreams for a different America. So I was wondering maybe if you can spell out what they envision, like what the consequences of their ideas would be.
Yeah, I think the different camps vary, and so we could parse some of that. But I think in general, it is a kind of looking back nostalgia that fuels a lot of this. And so you have a yearning for pre-civil rights America, the 1950s. You have a yearning for the founding era and the Republican revolutionary spirit that they see there, and the moral world that they project onto that world. And then with the Catholic neo-integralists, which is a subset of the post-liberal camp, you have a real yearning, I think, for a kind of medieval world, right? The world of Christendom is how they sometimes speak of it. And so those are that's the spirit of what's fueling some of this, the nostalgia. Then you have the tech bro contingent where they're willing to fuse this with much more modernistic approaches, but it's all quite authoritarian. And I think socially, what we're talking about here is a reversal of a lot of the progressive gains of the last 50 years. So that's tangibly what we're looking at. They want to overturn Obergefell. Yeah. I think they want to turn down, have a kind of, trad wives that they like the trad wives. And I think we're seeing some of not just the change in immigration law, right? And then they're trying to deport so many people and change the way immigration has worked since 1965. But also many people in this movement are aggrieved and think that there is reverse racism that is happening throughout every level of the state and through the bureaucracy and through all of the academic institutions. And so they want to not just overturning civil rights law and affirmative action very thoroughly is part of what they want to do. And then they are also trying to transform higher education.
And you can look at what the administration has been doing in higher education and in its treatment of the federal bureaucracy to kind of root out what they consider to be wokeism, right? By shutting down programs, by firing federal employees, by engaging very deeply in the universities and threatening to pull money if the don't sign on to what they want to do. So there is an agenda that is actually being put into place. You mentioned, I want to circle back to maybe the post-liberals for a moment. We mentioned the law professor, Harvard law professor Adrian Vermeule, and you spend some time in your book talking about his ideas and his notion of common good constitutionalism, right? His
Mhm.
idea of using the Constitution or using the deep state to put into place this vision of a new Christendom. How do you see that happening?
So I think this is important because a lot of what's happening now on the ground is consistent with this older rhetoric that's even consistent with something like the Tea Party, where, and certainly with the Claremont Institute group, where what they want to do is destroy the administrative state, right? We heard Bannon talking about that during the first administration, and now they're really trying to get that done. So they're destroying all these agencies, um, and so we all have a sense of what that is, I think. The Doge actions, yeah, and the end of U.S. aid, all of these things. I think I think often that's seen as in real tension with other parts of the New Right, such as Adrian Vermeule's whole teaching, which is a way of seeing the Trump administration, and I think for sure the Vance future, as a way of harnessing the powers of the state and using those to pursue their own agenda, right? And to use the power of state to reorganize the country, not just the laws, but also the culture. And so Adrian Vermeule is this very important figure, even though he's sort of out there. He's very well regarded. He's a professor at Harvard Law. He's very well regarded across the academy because he's kind of a young, he's been just this sort of phenom mind, very, very successful, very productive scholar. And most of his work is focused on the administrative state. But then in 2016 or 2015, he converted to Catholicism, and he started advocating for something called Catholic integralism, along with some other figures on the New Right. But that's the most radical version of Trumpy intellectualism, and it's really this quite overt effort to undermine liberal freedom and sort of reintegrate the church and state with a Catholic sort of nomos, right? Like a Catholic, a Catholic. I don't want to say theocracy, but there's something of a theocratic flavor to this, right? Where they're trying. So Adrian Vermeule is
by Catholic social teachings, right?
Informed by Catholic social teachings and aiming for Catholic ends, right? So aiming for the very Catholic conception of the good, which is focused primarily on salvation. So it's quite, and again, he doesn't say all this totally explicitly, but he's pretty explicit. And so but as a legal scholar, that's sort of more in his online writings about Catholicism, but he has also this scholarly persona where he has written this book called Common Good Constitutionalism. And this book is an attack on originalism and on living constitutionalism or progressive constitutionalism. And he's trying to assert that the true constitutional jurisprudence, the true model for American jurisprudence is this common good classical legal tradition that aims for the common good. And that provides this sort of substantive ends that are lacking in textualist interpretation of the Constitution. So textualists can look at the text of the Constitution and can and see some things there. And Adrian Vermeule says, no, there are clear. The American constitutional order is informed by this classical legal tradition that aims for the common good, which means justice, peace, and abundance, and health and security also. So he says we know what the American political order aims for. It aims for these Catholic ends, right? It aims for these Thomistic, or he uses different traditions, but he says we know what it's about, and so the Supreme Court can adjudicate accordingly. Right. And
it's a kind of a restorationist vision.
Yeah.
But a restoration of maybe his imposition of what the founders were, the framers were actually aiming at.
Yeah. I mean, I argue that it's an imposition, it's a projection, it's sort of a revisionist account of what the American legal tradition in all of its messiness actually is. There are all kinds of, legal arguments you can make, constitutional arguments, just different kinds of ways of understanding legal philosophy and the American history. But he's doing something very specific. And I think there's no question in my mind that things like the classical legal tradition or Blackstone or all of these different threads were informing the American founders and informing how people understand constitutionalism. But he is, his work, I think, he's claiming that that's the forgotten tradition, that his particular version of this is the tradition and has been long forgotten. And then he's also excluding certain parts of the tradition, including things like the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. So, I mean, we could get into the nitty gritty with this guy, but he's also done a ton of work on the executive power and basically has no problem with a very, very strong executive. That one of his books was called Executive Unbound.
Mhm. Yeah. And of course, he and Patrick Deneen have interesting intellectual engagements over the years. One could say that he famously sort of pulled Patrick Deneen from Deneen's earlier position as a kind of communitarian withdrawal from liberalism to this more substantive notion of integralism. What's your sense of how much legs these projects have? And you mentioned earlier that there are these different camps that have different visions of what America should be. So, in what ways are they part of a shared project? And in what ways do you think that they're going to come to loggerheads as this administration moves along?
Great question. I think that it's a bit of wishful thinking to think that they're going to really come to loggerheads within the conservative movement. Within the sort of MAGA new right, there are tensions, there are cleavages, but I think they're quite happy to go along with everything. They were happy to go along with Trump even after January 6th. So I think it's a little mistaken to think that I don't think they're going to eat each other, out of this movement. So you have someone like Patrick Deneen writing an article about how J.D. Vance inherits both the tech right traditions and the post-liberal traditions and is able to amalgamate them into something coherent. So I think that alone is a sign that they are going to stick together through this. So they have, I think they've been terrifically successful, right? They weathered January 6th. They captured many right-wing institutions like the Heritage Foundation, or I think of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Claremont Institute has been completely transformed in some ways by all of this. And they got J.D. Vance on the ticket, right? I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of factors here. It's not like they single-handedly did that, but that was a huge victory for them. They wrote up, their ideas are all over Project 2025. There's a lot going on in our politics, but these ideas, I think, are fueling a lot of it, or at least back padding it, right? They're giving justifications to what's happening, and they hope that Vance will carry the mantle. And even if he doesn't, I think at the state level, this movement has an enormous amount of power.
Yeah, I mean, Vance, was famously at Patrick Deneen's book launch event at Catholic University for Regime Change. He attended and gave an important speech at the NatCon event in 2024. So in some ways, Vance represents these ideas in a much deeper way than Donald Trump does. This book would have read quite differently had Kamala Harris won in 2024, right? You were been writing this book for a while. There was a possibility that the Democrats would have kept the White House. Given what you see, is the MAGA right winning? Like, you've mentioned their successes, you mentioned their influence. How do you gauge their actual power and influence in the administration today?
So I think they are winning, clearly. I mean, I think Vance is there he's the vice president. I think these guys are not unhappy with everything Trump is doing. They are the kind of culture warrior boosters behind a lot of it. So they might prefer Vance, and they know that Vance is more ideologically captured than Trump, but they are not opposed to what Trump is up to. So I think they're definitely winning. I think that I was trying to do a few different things with this book, right? It's an explainer. So I wanted to show what the book was about, and to sort of give profiles of these different figures. I wanted to show how alluring it is, right? And how you could get captured by some of these ideas. And then I also wanted to have a sense of urgency in the book. But I think that with but I think one thing I also want to convey is just how strange some of these ideas are and how much they are departures from a lot of what conservatives tend to think or just ordinary Americans take for granted in political life. These men have turned the country in quite a different direction from the sort of not just from neoconservatism or the old conservative establishment, but I think from the ideals of Abraham Lincoln for all kinds of things that the American public takes for granted and believes in strongly in individual freedom. And so for you, I think we can kind of one thing I wanted to convey in the book is how this stuff is really weird and kind of gonzo. It's important, but the American public, I don't think, is nearly as radicalized um, as the people I'm writing about. And so, if I wanted to kind of leave one thing for the reader, and just to answer your question about whether they've won or not, I think that they've won for the short term. They are in power now. They will. I think that they can be. It's an incredibly destructive movement, but I don't think that the American public is radicalized nearly to this degree or nearly as supportive of the things that are going on. And so I hope that readers can kind of differentiate the world I'm writing about from just ordinary voters who are not paying much attention and have all kinds of legitimate grievances about the direction of the country that are then being leveraged by the MAGA new right.
So you approach this subject as a political theorist,
Yeah.
and also approach this subject as a political liberal
Mm-hmm.
who recognizes the limitations of liberalism today, or at least as liberalism has been in the United States in the early 21st century. What would you suggest that liberals do, or people who are opposed to the new MAGA right do to counter this movement, to essentially hold on to a vision of America and an American reality that is pluralistic, that is democratic, that is interested in equal rights and human rights and the rule of law?
Um, I think it's really difficult right now. I mean, I want to just sort of have solidarity with people, and I hope that they're working hard to do what they can wherever they're situated to fight some of this. And to I don't have any easy answers to that question, right? I mean, I think that liberals have to. I don't really like this idea that liberals need to moderate their positions to appease some of this. The sort of centrist position is not exactly my own, though I do recognize some of the things that have not helped. So I think getting out there and talking to people, I think that we need I'd like us to think more about some of the moral arguments that we do, the principles we stand for, rather than just what we're opposed to, and to find the politicians and work for the politicians that are good at articulating that positive vision and that I think are good at reaching back into our history to use, because right now the MAGA new right is quite comfortable reaching back however they like into different parts of history and using that very rich and complicated and pluralistic history to bang a certain patriotic drum. And I think liberals who are afraid to use some of that history for a more liberal pluralistic vision are doing themselves a great deal of harm. So I think learn some history and then promote that and use that, and when you're talking about what Democrats stand for. I think that could be really useful to revive some of the language. Patriotic language is great. Liberal freedoms, right? Freedom and opportunity, I think, are really good things that everybody believes in. That we could do better to draw on. Abraham Lincoln is somebody I think really worth reading and learning from in this moment, because this is really a departure from, I think, what Abraham Lincoln stood for. So he's an inspiration. So that's my basic answer, Jerome. It's very difficult right now, though. So I think being out on the streets is important, right? I think that being out on the streets and working to win the next election and to protect the next election is really important.
And what kind of resources do you think that liberalism has as an intellectual tradition to not only counter this new right, MAGA right reactionary forces, but essentially capture some of that political energy and maybe capture a vision of what a public good could be in this country that's so big and vast and complicated?
Well, I mean, the liberal tradition is. I'm not a scholar of liberalism, Jerome, so I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question. I mean, I think that the history of and liberalism is such a sort of fluid word. I think it's hard. There are all kinds of wonderful liberal thinkers out there. There's a great book by a guy named Alexandre Lefebvre who wrote a book called Liberalism as a Way of Life. I think liberals need to start thinking in this way about how to defend liberal constitutionalism. But people will have their different arguments that they turn to. You know, I'm going to read something though. Okay, I'm going to conclude with a little thing which is a Lincoln quote, because this is how I think this is a moment where Lincoln gives us a way of thinking about the Declaration and about constitutionalism that is quite inspiring. So I'm going to conclude this with this little quote, okay? Because it's one little resource we can go to. This was from his speech on the Dred Scott ruling. The Dred Scott ruling, I think it was 1957, was declared that Black people were not really citizens and were not equal, that they were sort of inferior, but that it was an inferior race. Okay. And so that they didn't have the same rights that other Americans did. And Lincoln takes this up and he says that he thinks this ruling was an abomination, basically, right? And he says that it goes against everything that the founding fathers didn't live by, but what they were aiming for and sort of their aspirations. And so it's a speech that has this section that's all about equality and how the founders understood equality. And Lincoln says that the founders and the writers of the Declaration were not, that they were quite clear about how they understood equality. He says, they defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal. They were, he explained, equal with respect to certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said that the Declaration was, contra the Dred Scott ruling, intended by the founders to be a beacon of hope for a more equal future. And then he says this, he says, they meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances could permit. That's in the Declaration, right? They were intending in the Declaration to assert the right of equality. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. So that's the kind of anti-new right. That's Abraham Lincoln. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be better at recollecting and reaffirming.
I think that's a fabulous message. Laura, it has been fantastic chatting with you today. Again, Laura K. Field, the author of Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right, a fantastic, timely, and crucial book for us to be reading in these days. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jerome. And thank you. You were very helpful while I was writing it, as you know. So thanks so much. And thank you so much for having us.